welcome to our latest Horizons Institute Insight series. I'm Dave Riley, and I'm one of the research managers at the Horizons Institute at the University of Leeds. And today we have a special treat for you. We have Professor Barry Smith from the University of London, who's going to talk about navigating interdisciplinary research and its opportunities. This Insight series is something that we have been running for the past 18 months or so. And it is a space for us to explore interdisciplinary journeys and ideas in a relaxed and informal setting. We provide our speakers with a broad brief to speak about things that are interesting to them. Barry will speak for about 20 or 30 minutes, I think, Barry.
Yep.
And then after that, we will invite questions. So the way we do it is if you have a question, please do leave it in the chat with a Q and a colon, then we know to ask it. And if there's then time remaining at the end, we'll throw open the floor to virtual hand raises. So Barry has very kindly joined us today. He is the director of the Institute of Philosophy at the School for Advanced Studies at the University of London, which means he has a sas.org.ac.uk email address, which was very good, which I liked. The Centre pioneers collaborative research links between philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists. And you may have heard Barry on the radio with his series, The Mysteries of the Brain and the Uncommon Senses. So Barry, over to you. I'm going to see if I can find your slides.
Thanks, Dave. Very much appreciate that. And thanks for the invitation. Thanks for coming along. So the brief for me was to talk a little bit about how I ended up becoming much more involved in interdisciplinary work and working with other sectors and working with other parts of industry, and why I see that as very continuous with the things that I do in research and the things I'm interested in. So quite often people will say, when they look at the range of things I now do, because I'm working with food and drinks industry, I'm working with galleries and museums, I'm working with all sorts of people who previously may not have had any connections with philosophers. And even when I talk to businesses and I talk to other sectors, they say to me, but aren't you a philosopher? And they ask, how did you get from doing academic philosophy to this? So I was invited, I think, here to talk a little bit about how I did it, not as though it's the only way, but maybe there's some useful insights or hints about how we can go about it. So I was a philosopher working on mind and language, working on perception as part of the philosophy of mind, looking at how we perceive the world around us. And most philosophers deal with with vision and just think of how they see the world and how they sometimes they'll talk about how they hear the world. But I was interested in the senses that don't often get mentioned: taste, touch, and smell, the so-called bodily senses, or lower senses, as the church thought, because they reminded us of our carnal nature. It was all about us. And at the same time that I was doing academic philosophy, writing papers, applying for grants, going to conferences, I was also writing in an amateur way for the press about wine. I had a column for Prospect magazine as a wine columnist, and I was prosing on about the taste of a wine and how to enjoy particular bottles. And at some point I thought to myself, how does taste actually work? And to deal with that question, I thought, well, I better go and talk to biologists, neuroscientists, psychologists, people who study that. And when I probed a bit deeper, I learned two really interesting things. One, that what we call taste is never just taste, it's always taste, touch, and smell. And that the senses are always interacting with each other. They're always working in tandem to influence each other. And the other thing I learned when I started talking to my neuroscience colleagues about the senses is they told me, we have many more senses than 5. They said, if we look at where we are in that discussion, we probably have somewhere between 22 senses and 33 senses. And at that point, I thought, we have to talk. It's interesting that for the last 2,500 years, philosophy and philosophers and a lot of the general public would say we've got five senses. We've got seeing, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. That's it. And here we are hearing from the neuroscientists that we've got way more. So at that point, I thought we now can't go on just doing philosophy the way we do on the assumptions that we're perceiving the world through just five senses, or that the senses work independently of one another. And I decided that the best way to sort of inform the discussions that we wanted to have about perceiving the world around us and perceiving ourselves through our senses was going to have to be informed by the latest in neuroscience and psychology. And at that point, I found a friendly psychologist, Charles Spence, in University of Oxford, who I had been at conferences with, and we had talked and found occasions very often after those events when you were at dinner or when you were socializing to talk about overlap. And I decided to set up here in my institute a center for the study of the senses. Now that was done in a deliberate way. I wanted to invite philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists to belong to it. And I also thought for the reach and scope of such a thing, I would invite philosophers to co-direct it with me from different parts of the country. So we had a philosopher from Glasgow and a philosopher from Warwick and psychologists from Oxford. And once we got together, the way to generate any activity was, of course, to get a little bit, small amounts of money just to put on a seminar series. And the seminar series would invite people working on the senses from different points of view to come together, and we would have these discussions with a lot of different perspectives in the room. So we're all interested in how we perceive the world with our senses, but we would bring someone to talk, maybe a psychologist, maybe a neuroscientist, maybe an anthropologist. And then we would all be addressing the same topic, but from our different disciplinary perspectives. And that's often quite interesting because when you think these are perspectives on the same thing, you realize we have different vocabularies, we have different points of interest, we have different methods, different ways of working, which any of you doing any interdisciplinary interactions know that you come across that. And those discussions meant that we were learning from one another, we were learning from the speaker. And sometimes when we invited speakers, they would say, "Oh, you're inviting me to talk at a philosophy institute. So I don't really know much philosophy, or, I'll try to be philosophical." And we'd say, "No, no, no, don't do that. Please come and talk about your work in the way you would, your research in the way you would. And we will try to draw out some of the philosophical implications or interests here." And that Center for the Study of the Senses, with its regular seminar series, started to build up connections to people in neuroscience, people around the block. But we also knew we can't just ask them to come and talk to us and tell us what they know. It has to be worth their while. So it also meant that we would go out to talks by neuroscientists. We would attend some of their conferences. We would have to do the work and the reading and the kind of trying to come to terms with their methodology, their way of talking, their fantastically interesting new results. 22 senses, very interesting. How do the senses work? How does the sense of vision affect the sense of touch and vice versa? How does the sense of smell affect touch? How does what we see affect what we hear? All of these things were fascinating and certainly defying the way we usually talk in my discipline, my home discipline. And at the same time, we had to put in the hard work of learning their methods, their vocabulary, and occasionally asking questions, which people at those conferences would say, "Oh, that's very interesting," or, "I haven't heard that before," or, "That's a novel take." So in a way, we had to demonstrate that we had something to offer and that we were adding value to what they did. So we began to get more of a hearing. Once that Center for the Study of the Senses had been working for a while, it was possible that it had a bit of a CV and a bit of a track record and some good connections to key researchers and other disciplines. And then we were able to, that center was able to put in for a large grant from the AHRC, got 1.9 million. And from that, we were able to set up 2 labs within a philosophy institute, working labs where we could have philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists working together. And that attracted Colin Blakemore, Professor Colin Blakemore at the time, who was retiring from Oxford, to say, we invited him to come and give a public talk here. He liked the discussion with us, and he said, quite interested in what you do. I wonder if you would have room for somebody like me to be here, to have something really worth doing at the end of, my time in Oxford. So we're very lucky. I had to try to get the university and do a bit of fundraising to get funding for that chair, but we got it. We got him on board. That gave us the credibility. That brought us others. So why was I keen to do this interdisciplinary work? Well, there were things about the work the topics I was dealing with, taste, sense of smell, that I would have been doing in a purely philosophy-driven way, and I would have been missing key insights, new ways of thinking about these topics that I'd miss if I wasn't talking to my neuroscience colleagues. Also, those collaborations tend to speed up innovation. You get new thoughts, new ideas, new insights, new ways forward, which, taking back to your home discipline, are potentially transforming of it, in that you get a chance to say and discover new things and have new insights. So I found it very, very refreshing, very illuminating. Now, once the Center for the Study of the Senses had been doing its work, going out to conferences, we also, mainly as part of the remit for the large grant that we had here, we were doing public engagement. So we would go to places like the Science Museum, and we would put on events where we'd bring the public in, and we would invite them to experience for themselves the things that we had discovered about the way their senses work. And that idea of involving the public in our research is really key, because I always talk about why public engagement isn't a dissemination of what we do. It's better to think of it as a research tool. So we would take some of the work we do to the public, we'd involve them in it, we'd get their feedback, they would ask very good questions. Have you thought about doing this, or why not that? And it would shape the research. And eventually, we started to get interest from a number of different sectors. Galleries and museums were interested in our work on the senses. They said, you're talking about how the spaces we're in, the sounds we're hearing, the temperature of the room all have an effect on how we experience what's going on. That experience is multisensory, not through single senses, touch, taste, and smell as if separate, but multisensory. We're interested, as galleries and museums, in trying to defend why we have these rather large buildings that are expensive to heat and staff. And, when people can look at paintings online, you may be able to help us understand why it's a different experience, a completely different experience to be in a gallery and to experience a work of art there. So we started working with colleagues in Tate Modern. Took us about 2 years to convince them to let us do some experiments inside those galleries. So it's a long haul. It's a long journey. And then we became part of something called Tate Exchange, where Tate Exchange would be once a year, we would be given the 5th floor of the Blavatnik building in Tate to run a series of experiences and experiments put on by philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists, artists working together. And we were, in a way, as philosophers, a bridge between neuroscience, which people in the art and gallery curation conservation world knew was important, but they didn't know who to talk to or how to. And we would say, well, we're interested in the experiences people have of art and how they're shaped. And we have our partners in neuroscience, and we can bring them into the gallery and we can do things with the public to help them explore their experience of artworks and their experience of themselves and their bodies in perceiving. So we would run about 20 or 30 experiences and experiments. We deliberately use both of those. In other words, we don't want people to be like lab rats coming in and you test and measure them. We can do that in the lab, but we want to know if some of the things we're discovering in a laboratory setting scale up and work in the wild. But of course, the wild is too unconstrained. So galleries and museums are very good intermediary spaces where people come because they're interested, they're keen, they're a little bit controlled, but they're not lab-like. And we had to make the experiments interesting and exciting for people to do. So there are experiences they like to have where they discover something about how they perceive or hear or smell things around them. And then we can tell them that by gathering data from them and how they react and respond, we are actually using that to do work. And we published several papers as a result of the experiments we ran in Tate Modern. And that became something where we also thought we want to make sure that the public, if we take their data, we feed back to them, we tell them why and what we're doing with it, and we encourage interest in our work. And the interest that was generated in our work, would be picked up by other people, filmmakers, chefs, perfumers, all sorts of people. And by getting a little bit of press and attention, that of course promotes the research, but also we're building public support for the research we do, which is important these days when we're trying to convince people, if they're spending public money on the things we do, that the research we do is of benefit to all. And philosophy has got impact on parts of society and even on the economy, but it's sometimes easier when working with other disciplines in an interdisciplinary way to demonstrate the contributions that we make and to involve the public and show them why our research is exciting, transforming, it can matter, and it has applications. So a lot of the subsequent work that we did in the Center for the Study of the Senses was working with particular sectors. I am interested in taste, smell, and flavor perception, which is very multisensory. How we smell, the smell of food, the touch of it, the feel of it, the look of it, the sounds that we make when we're eating or that precede that can have a big impact on how we subsequently like or don't like what we're eating. It can feed into the fact that food companies try to manufacture the foods, sometimes foods that they can make cheaply, affordably, safely, but they make them with ingredients which we are increasingly learning can have deleterious impacts on their health, but they're interested in improving these foods in a sensory way to make them more appetizing, more appealing, more desirable, maybe even irresistible. And I had done some consultancy work with food companies, but increasingly have pulled back when instead of helping them reduce salt, fat, and sugar, they were wanting me to share my sensory knowledge to make these foods more palatable, more desirable. And as a result of doing that work, I have subsequently got in slightly into policy space in that I presented evidence to the House of Lords Committee on Food, Diet and Obesity to talk about what the food industry does and some of the things that I learned about it and some of the things I'm concerned about with so-called ultra-processed foods. So that ended up having policy impact, as well as us doing a lot of public engagement, policy engagement, public engagement. Also, my work on the senses led me to realize that in tasting and food, the largest part of what we call tasting is due to smell. So our tongues give us very little. They give us salt, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, savory. That's it. But if we're tasting things like pineapple, peach, mango, melon, we don't have melon receptors in our tongue or raspberry receptors. That's all coming from the nose. So an awful lot of what we call taste is due to smell. And you can't be interested in tasting and looking at the sensory experience of tasting, how it's created, what the systems and mechanisms are that go to work, from taste buds on the tongue to olfactory receptors to the touch and feel of food, the spiciness of it. You can't be interested in that without smell being extremely important. And that led me down a route I didn't expect, to start thinking about smell, both from an empirical and from a philosophical point of view. My philosophical interest is piqued because I have a philosophy colleague in Spain, Marta Tafalla, who was born without a sense of smell, but she didn't know she lacked a sense of smell until this was diagnosed at the age of 14. And since then, Marta's been trying to find out, what are these people talking about when they talk about sense of smell? She thought her perception of the world was complete. It was full. She was perfectly equipped to move around the world. She saw people putting their nose to flowers, and she did the same, thought that's boring. But then people tell her there's this thing we have, which is smelling the world, and she thinks, what is that? And it's invisible, you can't hear it. So she's been trying to find out what it is that she's missing. That's very philosophical thought about how to capture that experience or how to explain its absence. But because I was working on smell, I was contacted by um, patient groups who talk about having lost the sense of smell through head injury or virus. We were a tiny community of people looking at post-viral smell loss. And you can imagine our surprise when COVID came along and we started to hear reports from all over the world about people having lost their sense of smell. And they were contacting the charities and clinicians I was talking to and the patient groups I was talking to and saying, can you help me understand what it is I've lost? And of course, my work on the multisensory nature of taste and smell and how they connect in tasting was important, because people during COVID were saying to me, I've lost my sense of taste. And I would say, have you really lost your sense of taste? Can you put some salt on your tongue or sugar or lemon juice? Can you taste that? Yes, I can taste that. And then it was clear that they hadn't lost their sense of taste. They'd lost smell, and they now realized how much smell was contributing to it. So I had a very busy COVID, working with colleagues and patient groups, clinicians, writing papers and jointly writing papers and writing a report for the Office for Science for the British Academy. So there's a way in which a lot of the things I've done, which came from my own disciplinary interest in the senses and how the senses help us to perceive the world, changed and widened because I was working with colleagues in other disciplines also looking at the senses, who revised my understanding of the data I was using and the premises I was starting from. And although I still have philosophical questions as well as contributing, I hope, to empirical testing and experiments and discovery, it's enriched what I do. And I hope that what I contribute to those other disciplines is bringing an understanding, some thinking and some methods and some foundational thinking, which also is contributing to them. Now, let me just end, and we can open up for discussion by saying I'm very big. I'm a strong advocate of interdisciplinary work. I think it's terribly important, but I think it's hard won. It's not easy. You have to go through those tough conversations. It takes time, and that's why it's great to have the Horizons Institute is a place where you've got spaces to explore those collaborations. It takes time and it's hard won, but there are huge benefits of doing it. I also think good interdisciplinary work starts from a strong disciplinary base. Good fences make good neighbors. I'm not going to do the scientific analyzing of results and the statistical assessment of the data, and they're not necessarily going to do the philosophical framing. We must bring what we individually contribute and be open to and understand and learn what the others are doing and how what we do might fit in or illuminate it. And eventually we produce something that couldn't have been produced by any of us alone. I think that's the real gold in interdisciplinary research. And not everybody has to do it. And we need people to train those who are going to do it in their core disciplines so that they have methods and knowledge that they can bring to interdisciplinary discussions. So I still believe you need disciplines and interdisciplinary work to work alongside. But I do think that way of learning the vocabulary, learning the struggle, a little bit of conflict about what are the most important things to be doing here, what were the key ways of proceeding. All of those ways of working not only work when you have contact between disciplines and trying to bear down on the same thing, they also help when working with other sectors. There are different challenges, but when you're working with other sectors outside universities, some of the same skills are involved. So I do think those interdisciplinary skills have stood me in good stead to do the rest. So Dave, why don't I just leave it there and we can have a discussion?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks very much, Barry. I've really enjoyed that. I mean, I've got lots of questions. Hopefully if anybody else has as well. So if you could feel free to put it in the chat or just raise your hand. I'm using the hand raising feature. I'll give people a couple of seconds. If not, maybe people can think that I've got a question. I'll go. What comes through for me during your talk there was how much you enjoy this.
Yes.
And keep it fun. And it I'll just go right back to what you said at the start about the fact that you had your interest in wine, you had your wine column. And it's almost like you followed your curiosity. So what would you say to somebody who might be in a similar position who has a disciplinary base and a curiosity they want to follow? What would you say to somebody who wanted to do that?
Well, find out who's talking about these issues in a way that's going to give you something new and something exciting. You're right. I like it. It's very exciting. It's also interesting when you talk within your discipline to journal editors often say, gosh, we're so bored with the same, standard journal fodder. People are just sort of contributing the articles we expect. They're dying for something new, some insight, something kind of, that's a different take. And in a way, when you do interdisciplinary working, you get a different take on how you hear those questions and topics, and they can move you on in mind. They can actually be much more refreshing. You can have new insights. But how do you go about it? Well, find out who's doing anything interesting and work in this area. The other thing is when people are doing public engagement events, it's often thought that public engagement is, just to reach different publics. But the secret is you're also reaching sometimes other researchers who see, a well done event and they say, ooh, that's really interesting. And it's sort of related to what I do. Making contact is one thing. Contact's the first step of interdisciplinary work. But have you got time? Have you both got time and interest to pursue it? And as I say, we had to do a bit of, because we are the much less powerful discipline than neuroscience, we had to do a bit of the courting. We had to go along, go to people's talks, read their articles, ask them questions, follow up with them. And then if they thought, oh, that's interesting, then you've got their interest, and then you can do that more and try to, I invited a big beast of the neuroscience jungle here in London, in UCL, someone who shall remain, Ray Dolan. And I wanted to invite him to give a big lecture on his area of decision making, neuroscience, and he had resisted me for a while. So I thought I'll take him out to lunch. It took me a long time to get through his secretary and take him out to lunch. And when we went out to lunch, the first thing he said to me was, I don't mean to be facetious, but what does it mean to do research in philosophy? Well, by the end of lunch, he knew, and he agreed to do the lecture. So, you have to create opportunities and spaces for doing that. I see lots of questions, some of them in the chat. Shall I try to pick those up?
So Serge had his hand up first. So just go to Serge first, then we can go to the questions in the chat. So Serge, if you just want to unmute.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. That was quite interesting. So my question is about the mismatch. So then what's your experience of dealing about the mismatch between the methodological approaches? So then I can start by giving an example. So I work in linguistics, and at the same time I also collaborated together with people from medicine and from psychology. And one of the problems is to find to actually to articulate. So what is important on my side is the importance of ecological validity. So work with language, you need to work with a real language rather than with artificially crafted examples, which are tested in contexts which are not very, we are very very different from everyday, from any context in which language is commonly used. And on the other hand, the experimental approach, which is favored by psychologists and by neuroscientists, it assumes a very very tightly controlled environment in which you actually forget about all ecological validity, and therefore you have some social phenomena which work because there is society which is shaped in this way, and then this is all completely forgotten. And then it's so it was interesting to interact with them, but it was problematic, right? Because this important aspect of ecological validity was completely lost in their view. So then what's your experience? And probably you experienced something similar in your interaction with neuroscientists. So then what's
Yes, sure. I mean, I think we have to be a little bit open and generous. I talk about the four stages or the four C's of interdisciplinary collaboration. There's the communication to begin with. We're talking, we have shared interests. That's nice. Then we have confusion because they're using terms in a slightly different way to us. And the third stage, which I think you're pointing to, is conflict. And that's where one discipline says, no, this is the most important thing. This is the thing that matters. Now, you have to get through that by saying, well, that's most important in your discipline. I wonder if instead of it being what's most important in any one of our disciplines, there's something which we can all aim for that we can contribute to and that we can mutually shape. And when no one owns that, and of course, it might mean it's too vague and loose to actually be landed. But if there's something we really can aim for where we think we're bringing a little bit of our own expertise to it, then I think then we get to the sweet spot for cooperation. So you go through communication, confusion, conflict, and then cooperation, and it's that final stage. But you need time. You need time to do it. So it takes work. So thanks for that. I'm going to just pick up some questions as I see them. So
Okay.
Inez said, can you say a little more about how you balance the ethical questions around some of your food and drink? Yeah, yes, very much so. So uh, ethically, I mean, one reason I was tempted to work for the food industry was because they approached me saying, we want you to help us explain, want us to help us reduce the salt, fat, and sugar in our products so that we've got healthier consumers. And that seems like a good thing to do. If I can do that, that's great. There was a little bit of that, and some of them were very interested in that, of course. But I also started to realize that people were asking me to do more than that, and actually to say, well, can we take 30% of the sugar out of this and it still tastes the same? No, it might taste different, interesting, better. There are other things you could put in, and by the time they said yes, but how do we make it compelling? How do we make people want to go on eating this? And I thought, oh, that's not what I signed up for. So I started to say no to some of those things. And then I stopped working for some of those companies, and I won't work for those companies unless people are quite clear about what they're doing and have faced up to the ethical challenges. So I think we have to have our own standard of personal integrity we're using. In the drinks industry, I committed to responsible, sensible drinking, but I'm not there. And nobody in the drinks industry has asked me to promote alcohol. I'm much more interested in how do people make better choices and how do we. One thing I did for Diageo, for example, company who who make Johnny Walker whiskey, they got myself and my colleagues, they had us testing experts in New York, London, and Paris to see if experts could distinguish in blind tastings. They could make a division between single malts and blends. They can't. If you organize this in a particular way, they don't make a natural distinction. They group them, but not in that way. And so what's interesting to me there is the fact that everybody thinks single malts are finer quality and blends are somehow inferior. And there's a snobbery behind that, which isn't borne out. And also people who want to become more knowledgeable about whiskey think they have to learn this difference through tasting, and it might not be the case that can be done at all easily. So, we published this paper, and it was very important to us that we got to publish it. But when we published it, we wanted to make a big splash about it in the press. And the head of Diageo said, no, thank you for doing that research. We're not going to make a lot of fuss of that, because, of course, they were still selling single malts at a huge price. They didn't want people thinking we can buy a slightly less expensive whiskey and be satisfied. So that's interesting, but it so far drinks industry has not trod on my ethical toes, but the food industry did. Disciplinary expertise. How do we encourage young researchers to undertake interdisciplinary work? I think there's a real question about when's the right stage in your career to do this. So you need the training to be able to bring what you bring. I think once you're a graduate student and an early career researcher, might be during the PhD, it might be when you get your first postdoc position, but there or are looking for one. It's when the topic is such that you think, I want to work on this topic. I'm interested in this topic. Now, the question is, who do we need in the room to address that topic? We might need a biologist. We might need an economist. We might need, neuroscientists. We might need a chemist. And then thinking of how you fit into that group is a way of saying, it's because I'm trying to understand this particular topic that I think I will benefit from the insights of others. So I just give it as an observation that when you're in the humanities, usually it's easier to want to do interdisciplinary work when you're younger. Whereas if you're in the sciences, it's usually when you're older, because you have to go through, you're working on a grant as a young researcher, and you're having to get the publications, you're having to work for somebody else's project. So quite often you have to do that before you've got time to lift your head and see who else you can talk to. On the other hand, I've found very ambitious young researchers in the sciences who know it's a very crowded field. So what are they going to have to offer that makes them stand out or gives them some sort of extra interest? And sometimes if they're in interdisciplinary discussions, groups, reading groups, collaborations, then they suddenly can say more interesting things and be a little more distinctive and visible. Is the UK more discipline focused? A little bit. There's a little bit. I mean, it's interesting, certainly in Europe, when the word science is meant to be every science, including human sciences. And here we have, very big faculty divides. Faculties, grew out of 19th century considerations about how universities should be organized. They don't line up with the joints in nature. And some of the most interesting topics don't necessarily oblige us by being where the disciplines are. So this is why we have to find spaces within universities like the Horizon Institute and others, where we offer opportunities and incentivize opportunities to come together and make it possible. What else is here? What's the best way to rely on the quality of the researchers from a field? Yes, good. Yeah, I think you have to do a little bit of sounding out. I mean, there might be somebody talking about something you're interested in a different subject area, but you have to know if they're a good guide to that discipline. I was lucky. I mean, quite often, you go to conferences or you're seeing papers in an area, or you're seeing the press covering other people's research. You begin to see who are the ones who are making key contributions in a field. But you have to be sure when you're talking to them that they are good guides to the areas you don't know, just as, you know, you have the obligation, if you're contributing to an interdisciplinary collaboration, you have to have the obligation to say, let me tell you what some of the key debates are, what some of the you know, the framing is. Let me tell you what the big issues are, what, you know, what we care about as methods. All of that's important. And I agree. You think it's very important to be able to assess, and you do a little bit of, you know, you do a little bit of sussing out from how much this other person is listened to and what influence they have. You know, if you ended up finding the lone researcher or the lone research group who happens to have an idea that coincides with you, and you don't find out what are other groups saying, that's a problem. I mean, when I work with neuroscientists on smell, or I work with them on multisensory experience, I'm not just interested in their work. I'm interested in which other labs or groups are maybe critiquing them or in a debate with them. And that's what it is to do research, as we all know, as university researchers, right? I mean, otherwise we become like people online who say, I'm doing my own research, and you only listen to and talk to the people who are saying something that coincides with what you think. So you have to do a bit of detective work, Frederica, I think, is the answer.
Okay, so does anybody else have any more questions? Anybody like to put their hand up? We've still got 10 minutes or so. Gregory.
Thanks, Barry, for a terrific talk.
Thank you.
So you casually mentioned getting the 1.9 million pound grant. Could you talk a little bit about, from the funder's perspective, what seems to make the difference between an interdisciplinary project being attractively plausible and not?
Yeah. So I mean, I talked casually, and it wasn't casual. I mean, the steps were build the community of researchers, maintain that, do a little bit of co-writing, have the center already established with its seminar series, and then kind of try now to have a bit of track record and CV, so that by the time you apply for the grant, they say, this group really do work together. They haven't come together for the purpose of applying for a grant. Now, large grants like that, and increasingly other funders, Wellcome and others who do large grants, they will meet, if you get to the final stage, you'll have an interview, a panel of researchers will meet as a team. And I have been sitting on the Discovery Awards for Wellcome. You can tell at a glance when a team is presenting whether they work together. If they all just do their own bit and they're kind of quite oblivious of what the others are doing, you know, I've said my bit, I sit back, the other person then contributes their bit. If they're sort of sparking off each other, oh, Fiona can say more about this, or I'm going to hand over to, and they say, yes, as so-and-so said, and you see how they understand and relate to each other's working. That idea of a team who are already able to do those kind of interdisciplinary talks, that's very good. In the application, I think the criteria for the large grants were they you know, we wanted them to be innovative, obviously, but we also wanted to make sure they were reciprocal. In other words, we don't want interdisciplinary research where one discipline's a service industry to the other, like getting a whole load of computer scientists on board to just do your code, or, you know, or we need a population study in health. Could you go and do that? We're going to just take your population study and then use it for the things we're trying to argue for. No. There's got to be a way in which you both disciplines are getting something out of it, and both disciplines are you know, really taking on board and able to sort of change some of their assumptions, ways of working, or add to what they do because of that interaction. So reciprocity really matters. And then finally, you hope that the interaction, or you hope to see in the grant application, that the interaction is potentially transformative of the contributing disciplines. You might start to pursue things slightly differently in your discipline as a result of this interaction with other methods, with other ways of working, with other focus, with other ways of focusing on the topic. And I remember when this group was interviewed for rethinking the senses, they were asked, do you think this will be transformative of, of your discipline? And the answer by one of the panel members was, yes, but it'll take time. I thought that was right. So, again, I think it's quite good to show awareness of the challenges and the difficulties, to be able to say in your application or in your interview that you're aware of this. And here are some of the ways we're addressing it, by allowing enough time, by making sure that the people that we might hire on that grant also have time to go back to their home discipline and attend their home conferences and still feel in touch with their discipline, able to bring the best of what they do to us and not feel sort of isolated and stranded. And in the end, like any good grant application, you're saying, what's the current state of affairs, state of the landscape, what's missing, what do we want to investigate? How are we going to do it? Why are we the right team to do it? Why is this the right amount of money it'll take to do it? And if you convince them of that, hard to say no.
Thanks a lot.
So apologies if you've
Please.
if you've already covered this. I'm having some internet issues. I'm based here at the Horizons Institute, and one of the things that we do is obviously trying to get people together and just start those really early stage talks. So it was very interesting to hear about you taking someone out to lunch and talking to them about philosophy, but I don't have that kind of budget to take people out for lunch. Can you talk about some other sort of ways that you've started those conversations, how you help facilitate those really early stage encounters so that it fires off curiosity in people, hopefully, and allows them to explore next steps?
Yes, I mean, there are a number of ways of doing that. I mean, in a way, when I started talking about interdisciplinarity and was sort of invited by the AHRC to talk about it, my big mission was to say we can't just expect interdisciplinary collaborations to spring out of people sitting at high table colleges in Oxford or Cambridge and happening to talk to people in different disciplines, or just, I met someone after a conference on a train. So I think it's very important to see how that's done. And I hope we persuade funders eventually and others to think of places, spaces where those early conversations can go on, to give people time to develop those discussions, to see if they go somewhere, to incentivize them that we will can we provide small pots of money which might say, oh, I've had an idea and I want to bring a different group of people together, but it's not yet a grant. And I think what we should be doing is funding them to do a workshop, invite the people they think are necessary. Might be the workshop does it all and says, okay, we've figured out what was there, we're done and dusted. Or it might say it's really caught fire, we need another couple of meetings, and actually we should start thinking of a grant proposal. But you've got to think of how to have those early opportunities. This happened, I mean, in my institute, I know in the Horizon Institute, and you and your colleague Samantha Aspinall, who I work with a lot, I know that you create some of those opportunities. But here in School of Advanced Study and the Institute of Philosophy, we would hear from young researchers and we would invite them to tell us. There was a young researcher saying, a philosopher working in aesthetics, saying, I'm interested in both the aesthetics and ethics of archaeology. So there are two different discussions, people talking about these beautiful objects that we find and we display in museums, and then other people talking about what's the ethics of who owns them and whether we should have repair. But nobody puts these discussions together. And I thought, yeah, that's right. That's interesting. What's your idea? And then he started to say what his idea was. And we said, look, come down here to us, to London, put on a workshop, invite the people you want. He got people from the British Museum to come and talk. And then pretty soon he got a grant proposal together with the people who stayed the course with him, and got a standard response mode grant from HRC to start pioneering this work. I think we need those opportunities. But as I say, if you want to hear or attract people in a discipline that's a little far away from you and they're not used to working with your discipline, you have to go to them. You have to go hear their talks, go to their conferences, offer them comments on their papers. And if they say, wow, you're adding something we don't do. So we did that with the neuroscience community a lot. And then I felt so vindicated when Carl Friston, who's another sort of very important figure in neuroscience here in London and indeed in the world of neuroscience, when he started to speak at one of our conferences and he said, philosophers always ask the best questions. And I thought, yes, could we have that in stone and send it to the research council and all of our senior managers, like, just remember this. So you have to earn those sort of small steps. There are conversations that are interesting but don't go anywhere. People are sort of excited. Oh yeah, that's interesting. We must talk about it. And you can see there's an appetite, but no real follow through. And then you just have to say, well, that's not going to work. So yeah, but we do need such spaces, for sure we do. Let me pick up. Thank you. Let me pick up Inez's second question. Talked about the skills of interdisciplinary research, how they're translatable to external partnership working. Yes. Some of those skills are being able to say very clearly and very kind of crisply what you do and what you're working on and make your research accessible to others. Here's a great thing for what comes out of interdisciplinary grant writing is you have to write for the other discipline and for reviewers who are not in your field. So you have to make those research questions really clear. You can't make any assumptions that are not explicit. You can't use vocabulary they don't know. So you can get things really clear. So I think when you're talking to other sectors, to be able to say quickly and clearly what you do and help them gauge their interest and for them to say, oh, that's interesting. We'd like to talk to somebody about that. I think those are some of the skills. The other skills are dealing with the frustration. They often work at different time scales, entirely different clocks to we think, oh, I'll do this work and maybe in 6 months I'll have a paper. And if you're working, with an industry partner, they say, we'd like this wrapped up in 2 months. And you think, what? The other skills that you need are being very explicit about what you can offer and what both sides are getting out of it. So they both know and nobody goes away thinking, well, I thought you were going to provide me with so much more and you haven't, or we were never going to, provide all of that extra, funding. So very clear discussion about what each of you could get out of it and how it's complementary. I think that's one of the skills.
Cool. And with that, we'll bring the session to an end. Thank you very much, Barry, for your contribution. That was fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you for your questions and for coming along. Thank you. Appreciate it.